wash my dirty linen in public.
Oh,
that
I can do that. I'm quite happy to do that kind of a simulator.
I'd first like to thank James and Eliza and Jacob and Gleebooks tonight for hosting this event. So thank you guys on a Friday evening. But more importantly, everybody is here tonight. I'm blessed in some ways that COVID has made it a very personal event, and I look around and I see some really old mates that go back a long way to my childhood, teenage years, my early days in Sydney, and I treasure all of you. And then there's my new crowd of yoga enthusiasts, and there's a tribe of writers here who I've really valued in the last year to get me to this point. And I just really thank you all for your support. This book wouldn't happen if you didn't have at least a dozen people behind you pushing you on. I'd like to thank Dr. Christine Williams from SSOA for smartening me up, and all of you here in the room who helped me with different things: computers, stories, words, what not to write and what to write. And also to Tony Wheeler. And I'd like to particularly thank John Wedlick, who unfortunately couldn't come tonight. He's ill, who played a big part, so he'll hear about it on video. So normally I wouldn't even be sitting here. I'm one of those wild gypsy extroverts who heads off with a rucksack and doesn't sit still. And everybody's wondering how I've coped. And they say towards the end of your life, if you're an extrovert, you discover the other side, and if you're an introvert, you might just break out. So I've gone into myself, and instead of physical journeys, I've wanted to do this for a long time. And the stories come from 4 boxes of tatty-old copybooks and diaries that have moved around the world with me, and I haven't even reread them. So it's wonderful when we are grounded. I'm not one of these minimalist people, maybe some of you are, but I like to have all my books and grandmother's clock and the candlesticks and the old bed that's from my childhood. A bit of history is important around you. So that's what I've spent the last year doing, and then when I finished the book, I woke up and thought, gosh, there's something going on out there and I haven't been part of it. So I'm not going to talk too much, but travel will be a different place for all of us next year, and who knows. But and thank you to all of the SSOA members here today for the encouragement in all the Zoom classes, and to my techno friends. So without more ado, I'm just going to read a few snippets from a few stories. I'm not sure how, maybe you'd hold the mic here. And for those of you who don't know me too well, the book starts, we've all discovered the meaning of, the meaning of hard borders, which now relates to Victoria and New South Wales. Well, when I wrote this first...
Not that hard.
When I wrote this story last December, the only border that people were talking about was Brexit. And I'm and my good friend Anne here, we grew up in a small town on the border with Northern Ireland. And I grew up as a smuggler. My mother would pile us into the car to go to Northern Ireland, and I'll just read a little bit of this story that's called A Hard Border. Kerrygold butter is a high-quality butter brand from the cream of grass-fed Irish cows, and its popularity was increasing in the UK and Europe. The butter, wrapped in its distinctive golden foil with a green logo, travelled from Cork in the very south, only to be sold for 20 pence cheaper in Northern Ireland. It was nearly considered the cocaine of the 1960s. Whether a warm spring day or a rare sweltering Irish summer's day, our winter coats were donned for these excursions, and on leaving the village we pulled into a lay-by, and pounds of Kerrygold butter were carefully inserted under our oxters, a colloquialism for the armpit. At the English customs hut, the car registration was noted, and we were waved on. Tension tightened in the packed Beatty Volkswagen. Mammy had us under orders of best behaviour, and Daddy, impassive, drove straight ahead towards the stop sign entering the Republic. The officer inspected the boot, and we all had to step out of the car, It being well known, children acted as mules. My baby brother Cahill served as a good distraction, and his squalling or a smelly nappy often did the trick, and we got waved on without searches. It was important not to be delayed, as that butter was melting rapidly under the armpits. I remember so well on one occasion, when on stepping out, my mother just couldn't keep a firm grip on her pound of butter, and it dropped to the ground. There was dead quiet. "You've dropped something, madam," the officer said as he gazed at the splat of butter on the tarmac, and my poor blushing mother was highly embarrassed as she scooped it up in front of him. Under no circumstances was she going to let it go. Most officers overlooked small-scale personal smuggling, but you could sometimes get one who was rigid with the law and either confiscated goods or threatened imposing fines. Smuggling of all sorts was the norm for people of the borderlands. Baby prams could have a false bottom, or coffins filled with contraband. There was no end to the ingenuity employed to smuggle tobacco, cigarettes or alcohol, as well as butter. Livestock prices constantly fluctuated between north and south, and farmers did deals on both sides. Having farmers in the family, we would hear some hilarious tales of cattle swimming across rivers in the dead of night, and pigs sedated with Guinness to cross lakes by boat. Bureaucracy and identity tags were a thing of the future. So that was when I was 8 years old with the winter coat on a hot summer's day, and it moved on to there, and that's the rest of the story. And now we move on a few years, and all my life I've been a hiker, and I'm very lucky to have walked into base camp of Everest in the Nepal side, which is a long walk, and on the Tibetan side, the Tibetan border isn't always open, so this was one of those few times, and it was snowy and a pretty rough trek, and you have to contend with altitude sickness. But one of the reasons I travel is to meet the locals, and this is when I had this particular relationship with a lovely old Tibetan granny. The small hamlet was empty of people. Only dogs barked, agitated by our passing. The flat-roofed stone buildings looked battened down permanently against harsh winds and bad winters. Small windows soot darkened and most shuttered. We entered a 2-story building in a back alleyway, where 3 donkeys brayed downstairs, and a few scrawny hens pecked the dirt around them. Ascending to the living quarters above, Jampa then introduced his wife Georgie and extended family. "Toshi dilly," I greeted them. Granny at the fireside responded with a toothless grin and continued kneading shoe bread with weathered flowery hands. Tibetan greetings are deeply rooted in Tibetan Buddhism, and any efforts by foreigners are much appreciated. Just before dark, Jampa's son, who had remained in the field, arrived with a young American, Pete, thinking I would be glad of English-speaking company. However, it was the opposite. I was quite happy with the game of cultural sign language and comfortable silence. But Pete was a friendly type and was only travelling as far as the next village for a festival. In a while, 2 well-used candles were lit as we ate a feed of potatoes and eggs, and my head torch amused the children. Grandpa brought out some old batteries to test them, and on seeing they worked, promptly sold them to me for a few yuan. The canny dealer later produced a box of OXO cubes for the same purpose, and I happily humoured him. His big smile was sufficient reward. The family kept late hours, and after dinner, the son Jungge played the droma, the Tibetan guitar, accompanied by Grandpa on a goatskin drum. Jungge's 5-year-old son took this as a cue, and had no inhibitions beginning to dance, joined quickly by his older sisters. Pete and I shortly got the message that it was our turn, and we both jived to rock and roll. Then Pete started swinging to the jitterbug, which caused much hilarity. Granny couldn't rest and stood up, grabbed his arm, and imitated his gestures. This funny scene raised the roof. Her feet stomped rapidly under grimy worsted woolen layers, and her parchment face took on a wistful look of lost youth. It was a joy to behold. Teacups were filled often, and sampa handed about, roasted barley grains that proved teeth-busting. The merriment continued until midnight, when brushwood and a few animal skins were placed by the fire for Pete and me to lie down on. The children watched and sniggered as I removed my partial denture and brushed my teeth. Granny opened wide to show her toothless mouth and retired to the dark corner looking very happy. I was soon completely out of it on my rough bed. I woke early, keen to breathe the fresh mountain air and escape the stuffy room. The slumbering bodies about me might not wake for some time yet. As I crept downstairs, Granny was below in the dim dawn, feeding the donkeys and clucking at her hens. I pressed some notes into her hand and gave her a picture of the Dalai Lama, which transformed her old eyes. I carried a few with me for special people who would show kindness. We hugged an awkward goodbye, the Tibetans as emotionally undemonstrative as the Irish at the time, and I hit the road. Sad goodbyes after random meetings are never easy. And now the last piece I'll read is from a story called St. Patrick's Day in a Brothel. And Africa is my favourite continent for travelling in. It's very challenging, and if you want to meet the locals, you need to get used to shared taxis. And there's a particular etiquette to these shared taxis. So I'll just give you an idea of how you get from A to B. And there's no trains, buses or automobiles. There are rough dirt roads, and strangers quickly become curious friends. The day commenced before dawn in the wild north, where I was the last touted passenger to squeeze into the rear of a set place, a battered communal taxi with its particular etiquette. No foreigner ever gets to sit in the prized front seat, reserved for some chatty big shot male willing to pay the extra for leg comfort and keep the driver amused. The next choice seats are by the window, to avail of fresh air and a view, but usually slim, wiry men get these spots. A Muslim country, the women are squeezed in together, and in Africa are not wiry, but generally well endowed, often with a baby on the lap, lots of bags, and perhaps a chicken somewhere. I was seated next to two colourful fula mamas, one breastfeeding a baby, a cute toddler crouched on the floor, and the sorry chickens on the roof. Except for Big Shot and the driver chatting up front, there was silence in the rear until my companions became acquainted. We had ample time, as it was a 14-hour journey to Conakry. Towards dawn, we pulled off the road, and everyone disembarked for morning prayers in the direction of Mecca. While they prostrated on prayer mats, I watched a dusty sunrise over distant hills. The heat was getting up, and I already felt gritty as sweat mixed with the red dust. I would soon feel embarrassed looking so scruffy, as Africans always look fresh and relaxed in sweltering temperatures, dressed in immaculate, neatly pressed clothing. We made frequent stops for a group meal pee and smokes by the roadside, the blessings of thick sarong handy for females, as scrubby bushes were thin on the ground to shelter behind. This scenario had to me the most blessed scene of camaraderie amongst women that you wouldn't see in the West. A group of females on their hunkers, doing their business, chatting away regardless. We pulled in at small roadside stands where plastic sachets of water, chewing gum for the 3-year-old, and disposable nappies for Junior were purchased. Sadly, at one stop, I noticed that the trussed chickens were now deceased, hanging limply from the roof rack. Big Shot was a businessman who spoke good French and a little English. Curious, he interrogated me on the reason for my journey and wanted to know where I lived. Then he asked that problematic question I generally get asked. Why would a solo white woman travel in such a basic manner when I was rich and should be flying or hire a private taxi? And finally, why didn't I have children and at least 4 grandchildren at my age? And where was my husband or son? Sometimes I invented a husband, but usually I was honest and stated that I liked my independence. This statement quickly had the women nodding and grinning jubilantly, while the men scowled. A rebel in the ranks was contaminating their subversive women with Western ways. I'll leave it at that. That's just a taster. That story was in West Africa, and there's something wonderful about the exuberance of people who experience a lot of hardship with dictators, corruption, climate change, drought, being ripped off by world banks and bureaucrats, and still laugh, survive and dance. So I really like going there. It's a challenge. And when I travel, I try and get off the beaten track, and it's becoming increasingly more difficult to meet local people. Mass tourism, they're fleeing to Europe or for better lives elsewhere. But yeah, why travel to another country if you don't meet the people on the ground? So I leave it at that, and if anybody's got any questions for me, I'm renowned for talking too long, so I hope I didn't do it. Overdo it. Okay.
Jacob is moving there at the back with the microphone, so if anybody wants to ask questions. Gerdette has covered everything, as I said, not only New York, Paris, London and Munich, but Tibet and Southern Africa, Rwanda, Japan, Timbuktu, and everywhere in between.
And I still have a bucket list. And I do have a twinge of guilt about carbon footprints, I have to admit that, and I value the joys of a staycation, and where would you get a better staycation during COVID than in Sydney?
Excellent.
Hi Gerdette.
Hi Bronwyn.
I've just got a question in regards to a lot of your international travel that you've done. Now that a lot of the international borders for Australians, people living in Australia going overseas, that will be closed for maybe another year, do you have any plans to travel within Australia and write about travels within Australia, particularly maybe in regional and remote areas of Australia?
Yes, that's a very good question. I lived in Australia for 5 years in the late 80s, early 90s, and even though I was living back in Ireland for the last 20 years, I've been a regular visitor to Australia, and I've discovered that I've seen an awful lot of Australia that some Australians haven't seen. I've been lucky to go up to Arnhem Land and over to Tibi Islands, and when COVID hit during the year, I was booked on a camping trip to the Kimberleys and the Bungles. I'm really interested in Aboriginal rock art, and that's the area of Australia I haven't seen yet. My job and career was a radiographer, and sadly I started experiencing orthopedic injuries. I wanted to finish my career working in Indigenous areas, and sadly I turned down a job on Thursday Island once and the Whitsundays because of a man, so never do that, girls. Yeah, and Tasmania is a wonderful part of Australia. When it gets too hot in Sydney, it reminds me of Ireland. There is one story in the book called First Encounters, and let me just say I came to Australia during the 1988, a very controversial year for Australia Day, so it might make interesting reading to a few people. But I am looking forward to going bush and getting the tent out and shaking the gammy hip.
Excellent. Anyone else have any questions?
Yes, Margot?
Is there any place where you wouldn't go back?
Wouldn't go back. I tend to. Yes. Somalia Somaliland. I got caught in no man's land on the border with no visa and with dog shit and nearly attacked by rabid dogs, so that would be one place. I do have places I love going back to, but Tony Wheeler once said he's got a lust for travel and likes to visit a fresh place where you know nothing. And I like, some people do an awful lot of research when they go to a country. I like landing at the airport, not knowing what's happening next and taking it as it comes. And every country has some value, whether it's the people, nature, something. Yeah, and sometimes small is beautiful. It's not what we expect, and you turn a different corner. But I love Switzerland, any country that's got mountains, trees, and pristine beaches with no plastic, and tick the box.
I think that probably answers my question in a way, because I was thinking along the lines of having read all your diaries again and relived all these experiences, what was the experience that you often think about, that you go back to, that really did have an effect on you? Can you think of one? It may have been good, it may have been bad, but there must have been something your mind just goes back to and you relive a little bit.
Sometimes things kick in on the news. There was a brilliant David Attenborough program the other day, and Poppy the gorilla, she's a favourite of mine, and she's gone to her maker now, and it showed Poppy's grandchildren. So I've been lucky to see the gorillas in Rwanda, and particularly Poppy's tribe. And last year, George, the last of his species, died in the Galapagos. And I patted poor old George too, he never did find a mate. So there's little connections to strange places. And we have Will here tonight from the Caribbean. I have a special connection to a lovely Irish Caribbean lady in Montserrat, the Emerald Isle of Caribbean. So yeah, we spread ourselves far and wide, and I like to think you'll find connections with people everywhere. So I haven't yet been on a journey where you don't hitchhike and somebody gives you a ride, somebody invites you home for tea. People think things change, but they don't really. Human beings are a lovely species, and I've been robbed lots of times, usually my own fault. And you've just got to try and think that the person taking your stuff needs it more than you.
Not necessarily.
Yeah, not necessarily. Yeah. Did that answer your question, Nita? I wasn't sure.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's sort of, you asked a question I was thinking, I just kind of went that step. It's great.
Yeah.
Leads on to my question. You said you went off the beaten track a lot. As a white woman travelling alone, were you ever in fear of your life?
Yes, one of my trusty companions before they changed luggage on planes was a Swiss Army knife. And I remember I was hiking in India once and I had it ready because there were two guys following me. And I jumped out of cars like somebody else I know here in my writing class who hitchhikes or did hitchhike. And we've all had those dodgy times. But in all my 40 years travelling, my worst experience for assault was on a day off in London on Good Friday. I was walking along the canal in East London and a young guy pounced on me with an Alsatian dog, and I had to talk my way out of that one. And I was so scared I didn't even go to the police. So that was 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and I've long learned that what's the point? I tend to be a fearless kind of person. And another time I was hiking in the jungle in Borneo, and a Swiss girl was ahead of me who had been raped in one of the logging camps. And I remember that my strategy was to think through how that might be. I don't know why I did that. You know, sometimes you just, if you talk yourself through it, then it's not anyway, the worst has never happened, and I just try and believe that humanity is good. rather than the other way around. So and maybe I've been lucky.
Remember,
And opening your mouth and talking is wonderful. If you're silent, you're acquiescent, which I know is not a nice thing to say probably.
remember you're talking to a butter smuggler from the border county in Northern Ireland. They don't get shit from nobody.
Hi.
Oh, hi there. Hi, Carol.
Hi. Where was the point in the writing, because I know you were writing for your family originally, it was going to be for your nieces and everybody. Where was the point where you sort of decided that it was going to become a novel? There must have been a little point of time when you changed that.
That's an interesting one. I never set out to do this.
No.
I don't have children, and I love my nieces and nephews, and they've heard all these stories. And it was a bit like a legacy. And as people will testify who are in the writing group, because I've been to 3 writing groups every week, one of the complaints probably is that I didn't deal with the personal too much. People were wanting to hear more of me. And perhaps I wasn't ready to reveal too much that was personal. I've had some rough times in my life, and I've let them go and moved on. And travel has been my passion, and the diaries have been put to good use. And I wanted to test myself out to see if I could produce something that would be neutral for everybody. A little bit of everything, and whatever anybody thinks, it's the best I can do. And I will do more personal memoirs for family and friends, but and as I've discovered, when you start writing anything that's memoir, you make a lot of enemies. And you need to be very careful what you write and how blunt you are. So yeah, I've yet to venture down that road, Carol, but I will continue. Yeah.
Excellent. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions, if anyone has one.
Do you have any particular travel writers that inspire you?
Yes, Enid Blyton was my first one when I was a kid. I had a famous 5 club and loved running away from home to the woods and adventures. And then that moved on to, have you heard of Dervla Murphy? Dervla Murphy is a wonderful, she must be now about 87. She's an Irish travel writer, and they have some of her books downstairs. And she lived in rural Ireland and minded her mother until she was 30. And back in the 50s, she cycled from Ireland to India on a bicycle and worked in a Tibetan refugee camp. And then she went to places like Baltistan and the Cameroons and Madagascar on her own. And then she didn't like talking about her personal life either. She produced a daughter in her 30s. And Rachel was put on a bike and put on the back of a horse and went with her. So Dervla Murphy bought a new bike for her 60th or 70th birthday and cycled down through Africa on the AIDS route. So yeah, and she likes roughing it and having a beer with the locals, so my style. Yeah, and I do, I should say I'm not too fond of some of the travel writers that people know well. Maybe the old colonial style writers who knew people in the embassies in Afghanistan and had their connections. And but Lawrence van der Post, I liked some of his writing, and who wrote the book on the Marsh Arabs in Iraq. People who go into remote spots, I like to hear about it.
Excellent. Do we have 1 more question? Well, that seems like a good place to wrap up. We have books down near the front back here if you want to buy any. And they'll be signing the books up front. Excellent. Thank you once again.
Okay, thanks, Jacob. Thanks, everyone.